The state of Alaska in the United States is renowned for its scenic beauty and rugged landscapes. It's also well known as a playground for hunting and fishing. When we think of hunting, we usually think of people stalking wild animals. But sadly, that hasn't always been the case. In the instances I'm about to relate to you, the prey was very much human. In the outskirts of Anchorage, Alaska's largest city, a city where icy winds conceal dark secrets, a monster walked among the ordinary people. Let's look at the details. On September the 12th, 1982, two off-duty Anchorage police officers were hunting moose in the Knik River area, about 20 miles outside of Anchorage in the wilderness. As they pushed through the heavy undergrowth and emerged into a slight clearing, they were absolutely shocked at what they found. They appeared to have stumbled upon a shallow grave. There was what looked like a boot protruding from the shallow grave, and as they approached closer, they saw there were indeed human remains. They left the scene undisturbed. They were police officers. They knew what to do. And the following day, forensic technicians from Alaska State Police were on the scene. They examined the grave and found the remains of what appeared to be a female. There were clothing remains, the remains of an elastic bandage of some form, but most significantly they also found a .223 caliber rifle shell casing. A subsequent autopsy determined that the victim had indeed been shot, and dental records identified the victim as 23-year-old Sherry Morrow. She was an exotic dancer who had worked at one of the Anchorage clubs that had proliferated when lots of workers had come into the area to work on the Alaska pipeline. She'd been reported missing about a year earlier by her boyfriend. At that time, she'd told her boyfriend and some of her friends that she'd been offered $300 by a professional photographer to do a private nude photo shoot. She'd accepted this, but sadly after she told them, she disappeared and her friends and her boyfriend never saw her again. The Alaska police asked the boyfriend to come in so that they could give him the sad news. From the description of the clothing that he gave to the police, they matched it to the clothing found at the gravesite. But one significant thing was that Sherry always wore a lucky arrowhead pendant on a necklace, and this was missing. Police thought that Sherry was probably murdered very shortly after she went missing, and this would give the murderer, either a he or a she, about a year to have covered their tracks. It gave them very little hope of finding the perpetrator. In the year following the discovery of Sherry's remains, the remains of more bodies started to turn up. On September the 2nd, 1983, during the construction of a road in the same area not far from where Sherry's remains were found, more skeletal remains were discovered. These appeared to have been there for some time, and yet this area was very, very remote and usually only accessible by either boat or light aircraft. But one of the things that alarmed police was that by these remains they found another caliber .223 rifle shell casing. It appeared there were very great similarities between the two killings. These remains were eventually identified as those of Paula Goulding, an out-of-work secretary who had moved to Alaska from Hawaii looking for better prospects. In the meantime, she had also taken a job at one of the local clubs as an exotic dancer. By now, the Alaska State Police were becoming very concerned because of the similarities between the two killings, both exotic dancers, both having been killed by a .223 caliber high-powered rifle bullet. Things were pointing towards the possibility of a serial murderer. These two bodies had been found, but the police began to think that there would be more, and they started looking into missing person cases. As they did so, they found a lot of these were ladies who worked either in the sex industry in Anchorage or as dancers in the clubs. Previously, no one had particularly been concerned about these missing persons, one, because in this area, missing persons weren't a particularly high priority, and people like sex workers and the girls that worked in the clubs were quite often viewed as second-class citizens. Now, they put together all of the evidence that they had found. These two women had been both killed using what seemed to be a high-powered hunting rifle, and they were both exotic workers in the sex industry or the club industry. Putting all the facts together, it was very strange. It was almost like, with the nature of their deaths and the places that they were found, these women had been hunted in the wilderness. Little did the state police know, but events were about to take on an even more sinister turn. Whilst they were formulating their ideas about a possible serial killer and how they were going to look for this person, Anchorage police were dealing with their own strange incident. Now, to look at this, we have to go back to the period just prior to the finding of Paula Goulding's remains. The time is June the 13th, 1983, and the place is a highway going through Anchorage. Ordinarily, this highway might be busy at times, but on this particular day it was quiet. But one thing was way out of the ordinary. Running down the middle of the highway was a young girl. Now, this girl was 17-year-old Cindy Paulson. She was running down the street half naked. She had on just a flimsy top and her underwear. She was barefoot. She was breathless. She looked terrified and appeared to be running for her life. And the other really strange thing was she was handcuffed. Now, she continued to run down the highway. A pickup truck came up behind her and she managed to flag him down. She got into the passenger side and literally begged the driver to drive on. The driver did so, and at that stage she couldn't even explain to him what had gone on. She was that out of breath. And he looked around and he couldn't see what might be threatening her. He offered to take her to the local police station, but she said no and asked him to take her to her motel. He dropped her off and watched her go inside, but he was sufficiently perturbed that as he drove away, he decided to notify police of what had gone on. And when Cindy went into the motel, the desk clerk also looked at her state and the fact she was handcuffed and decided to call the police as well. Police soon attended. When they knocked on the door, she opened up and they could see she was absolutely distraught. They also noticed that she was handcuffed, and after calming her down, the first thing they did was take off the handcuffs. One of the officers was a man called Greg Baker. He was there with a colleague, and he was the one who did most of the questioning of Cindy. The story she told was quite fantastic, but both officers would say that she appeared completely credible. She said that the previous night she'd been going about her business. She was in fact a sex worker, and a man had pulled over in a car and offered her $200 for oral sex. She described the man as quite wiry, wearing glasses, and he also had a stutter, but he seemed fairly harmless. And so she got in his car. But as soon as she'd got in his car, he leaned over, she thought, trying to help her put on her seatbelt. But what she hadn't seen was the pair of handcuffs, which he then slapped on her wrist, chaining her effectively to the car door. He then pulled out a wooden-handled revolver and threatened her with it. He told her to sit still, not to call out, or he would kill her. He then drove her to a quite respectable neighbourhood. He pulled up at a house and took her inside. He took her into the basement, which looked like some form of hunting den. There were trophies of animals all over the walls, but there was also a chain in the middle of the room coming from the ceiling, and he chained her up by the handcuffs to this chain. Over the next few hours, he started to torture her and he raped her on several occasions. And when he'd finished doing what he was doing, he said he had to go for a nap. When he eventually woke up, he took her down and said that he was going to take her out into the wilderness where he had a cabin. Under ordinary circumstances, such an offer might seem innocuous, but after what had gone on, Cindy knew this was probably a one-way trip. She would not be coming back. He took her out and put her in the back of his car, and he drove her then to a local small airfield, Merrill Field. He drove the car to a small hangar where there were a couple of light aircraft. Leaving her in the car and threatening her not to do anything and not to make a sound, he then went over to one of the small aircraft and started to put various bits of equipment in, including several more guns. Cindy watched him as he did this, and what she decided was this was her one and only chance for escape. If he got her in that aeroplane and took off and took her to the wilderness, she would never be coming back. And so carefully and quietly she opened the door, and when she saw he wasn't looking, she ran. Miraculously, Cindy managed to reach the highway before he could catch her, and it was at this point that she saw the pickup truck and managed to flag him down and make her escape. All of this she related to the police officers, and they said they'd have to take her down to the station for further questioning. But on the way, Cindy insisted that they call off at Merrill Field. She wanted to show them the hangar where the aircraft was and point out the aircraft. The police did this. They wanted to get any clues they possibly could, and when they arrived at the hangar, the plane that she'd seen previously was still there. It was later identified as a blue and white Piper Super Cub. Leaving Cindy in the police vehicle, the officers went out and examined the plane as best they could. They took things like tag numbers off of the tail, and while they were doing so, one of the airfield security guards pulled up in a vehicle and spoke to the police officers and said that he'd seen a vehicle around about the hangar by this aircraft. Luckily, he'd taken the registration number of the vehicle and he was able to give this to the officers. After investigating a bit further, the officers found out that the vehicle and the plane belonged to the same person. It was a local businessman, a man who owned a bakery in Anchorage by the name of Robert Hansen. Quite naturally, based upon that evidence and the fact that Cindy had identified the plane, and she also identified the vehicle from the description given by the security guard, the police wanted to speak to Mr. Hansen. After dropping Cindy off at the police station, they went to his home and they arrived very slightly before him, but he pulled up in the very same vehicle that had been described by Cindy and the security guard at the airfield. They asked Mr. Hansen if they could have a word with him and ask him a few questions, and he seemed, to all intents and purposes, perfectly relaxed. He didn't seem at all shocked that there were police at his door. He invited them into the house, and the police explained the accusations that had been made against him and asked if they could have a look around the house. First of all, he denied the allegations that had been made against him, and he said that he had at least 2 friends who he'd been with during the time that he was supposed to have been committing this crime, who would vouch that he had been at their houses. He also denied any knowledge whatsoever of Cindy Paulson. But he also agreed for the police to have a look around the house. He said they didn't need a warrant. He was quite happy for them to have a look around. And as part of this look around of the house, the police found themselves in the cellar. It appeared to be exactly as Cindy Paulson had described. But there was no sign of any wooden-handled revolver. There was also no sign of any chain hanging from the ceiling in the middle of the room. Despite the fact that Cindy had described this room, the evidence was just circumstantial. All it pointed to was the possible fact that she'd been in this house. The officers thanked Mr. Hansen. They went back to the station to question Cindy a little bit further, and in doing so they pointed out the fact that this Mr. Hansen had what seemed to be a cast iron alibi from 2 of his friends, and they asked her in this process if she would take a lie detector test. Now, for reasons unknown, she declined to do so. Inevitably, this cast doubt on everything she was saying, and the police could take it no further. Cindy left the police station and subsequently left town. Now, even though Robert Hansen had an alibi from 2 of his friends, and there was only circumstantial evidence that he'd had any involvement whatsoever with Cindy Paulson, Greg Baker wasn't happy with the situation, and he decided to look into Mr. Hansen a little bit more deeply. He wanted to check if he had a criminal record, but at this time, a lot of the records at Anchorage Police Station were still held on paper. So he had to go to a repository where many of the paper records were kept. Eventually, he managed to find the paper records of Robert Hansen's previous convictions. It appeared Mr. Hansen, this upstanding businessman, wasn't as white as he'd previously been painted. Looking back over the years, Robert Hansen had a record of assaults against women and petty theft and at least one of arson. And taking this into account, alarm bells started ringing in Greg Baker's head. He decided to pursue the case a little bit further. He did this in spite of the fact that his direct boss had said there was no mileage in it, all of the evidence against Robert Hansen was circumstantial, he had an alibi, and the case should be dropped. While all this was going on, the state police were pursuing their own investigation of both the missing women, the bodies that had turned up, and trying to get a handle on who might be responsible for these crimes. And in doing so, they felt they needed to enlist the help of the FBI. Now, the FBI at Quantico have a behavioural analysis unit, one of whose jobs is profiling possible serial killers. And at that time, one of the best guys to do this was a guy called John Douglas. And the state police approached Mr. Douglas to see if they could get an offender profile. And in due course, John Douglas came up with the profile of what he thought the offender would be like. And this is where it all comes together. Greg Baker, in spite of the fact that he'd been told to drop the case, felt that there was sufficient evidence of some sort of involvement with Robert Hansen that he should go to the state police. He went and spoke to officers from the state police and laid out all the evidence that he had, including Cindy Paulson's testimony. Robert Hansen had a history of assaults against women, and he wanted to get state police's perspective on it. When they saw the evidence that Greg Baker had brought in, the state police were quite shocked. They looked at the person that Robert Hansen was. The profile they'd been given said that the offender probably would be an upstanding member of the community, he'd have a steady job, and no one would suspect him. However, he would have a criminal record, and there could be a possibility that one of the things he'd perpetrated in the past was arson. And this meshed with one of the things that was in Robert Hansen's criminal record. Another thing that the profile said was that he is likely to have some form of speech impediment. And from the evidence given and the fact that the police officers had interviewed Robert Hansen, they all knew he had a stutter. The parallels between the evidence amassed by the state police, the evidence brought to them by Greg Baker, and the FBI profile were astounding. Based upon that profile, and based upon the evidence that Greg Baker had put forward, and the testimony of Cindy Paulson, it was sufficient for Alaska State Police to put everything in front of a judge and gain a search warrant for Robert Hansen's home. The judge granted this, and Alaska Police prepared to pounce. On October the 27th, 1983, Alaska State Police were waiting in the morning outside Hansen's bakery. He'd not yet arrived for work for some reason, but eventually he did, and as his car pulled up in front of the bakery, the state police got out and asked if he would come to the station to answer a few questions. He appeared to put up no obstruction to this, and he got into the police car and went with them. And when they got to the police station, they took him to an interrogation room, and the walls of this interrogation room had been prepared beforehand. They were adorned with maps, photographs, and everything to do with the places that the bodies had been found. He was left in the interrogation room for a while, just to soak up this atmosphere, if you will. In the meantime, other officers had swooped on his home. His wife was home at the time, and she was completely shocked when these officers arrived, and they said they had a search warrant to search the property. While they were doing so, a wife of one of the neighbours noticed everything that was going on and came out and spoke to one of the officers and said, "Look, I don't know what's happening, but there appears to be some trouble. I just have to tell you that my husband, who's a friend of Robert Hansen, said that he was at our house on a particular day. And for some reason, I don't know why, my husband lied. He wasn't here at all." All of a sudden, Robert Hansen's alibi was looking very, very shaky. It seemed that he was indeed involved in the abduction and the torture and the rape of Cindy Paulson. Now, a thorough search of Robert Hansen's property was conducted, and eventually the police went up into the attic, and hidden away in the corner of the attic, they found a high-powered caliber .223 rifle. It was specifically a Ruger .223 Mini 14, but it was definitely the type of rifle that might have been used on at least 2 of the victims that had been found in the wilderness. They also found a bag containing items of jewellery, one of which looked like the arrowhead pendant that Cherie Morrow had been wearing when she went missing. All of a sudden, evidence was beginning to stack up against Robert Hansen. The other item which was of great interest to the police was an aviation map. Now, they knew he was an aviator, he had his own light aircraft. But suspiciously, throughout areas of the wilderness, there were some 34 to 37 X's marking various positions. Investigators returned to the police station and questioned Robert Hansen for hours. He had a very, very calm demeanour about him, but this would belie the horror of the confession that was soon to come. As he was presented with more and more evidence, some of which was forensic, by this stage his rifle had been matched to the 2 shell casings found at the 2 grave sites, and the map, 2 positions of which also corresponded to the grave sites, and the fact that jewellery which had been taken, all of this had been found on his property. Eventually, he had no option but to confess. He began to detail how he had previously lured vulnerable women under the pretense of a benign encounter, either for procuring sex services or under the pretense of being a photographer and asking them to do a photo shoot. He said he would restrain them with handcuffs, he would torture them, he would rape them, and then for the most part he would transport them via his light aircraft into the wilderness where he had a cabin. And this is where the second part of the lady's ordeal would begin. After being flown to the wilderness, the command "run" would be given, and this would be the opening gambit in his twisted game, a hunt from which there would be no escape. Robert Christian Hansen was born on February the 15th, 1939 in Estherville, Iowa. He was raised by an American mother and his Danish immigrant father, who was himself a baker. Robert Hansen had a fairly turbulent upbringing. His father was very domineering. He bullied Hansen and he forced him to work in his bakery, sometimes working long hours from the early hours of the morning up until the time when Robert Hansen went to school. Whether it was because of the stress of the way his father treated him and domineered him, he developed a pronounced stutter. He also suffered from terrible acne, which meant that he had a fairly torrid time at school as well. He was bullied because of his stutter and the way he looked. He was shunned by his peers and got none of the friendship that he longed for, and this turned into a burning anger against all of those around him. And it was this anger that would eventually turn into seeking revenge against some of these people. Seeking to get away from some of the traumas of his youth, when he turned 18, Hansen joined the US Army Reserve, where he served 1 year. He was then discharged, and he started to do some work as a drill instructor for the local Pocahontas police force. However, the desire for revenge was still bubbling under the surface, and after a brief marriage in 1960, he was indicted for a charge of arson, and he was in fact guilty of this. He wanted to take revenge against Pocahontas Roman Catholic school that he'd attended. The revenge he wanted was against both the people who had bullied him and also the people who had not protected him from this bullying. And so he went to the Pocahontas school bus barn and burnt it down. Once he'd admitted to the crime of arson, his wife divorced him, and he did spend some time in prison. During his time in prison, one of the psychiatrists said that he was prone to manic depressive episodes and possibly schizophrenia. In 1967, having been released from prison and having remarried, Hansen relocated himself and his family to Anchorage in Alaska, hoping to start over. And it was here that he opened his own bakery, following in his father's footsteps. And it was here in this vast remote land that he effectively reinvented himself as an upstanding member of the community and a very talented hunter. And it would be this reputation that would soon serve as a mask for his unspeakable crimes. During his confession, further details became clear. Anchorage's nightlife provided him with a never-ending pool of vulnerable women on which to prey. And with his geeky, unassuming demeanour and his reputation as an upstanding member of the community, he was the last person that anyone would suspect of any wrongdoings. Under the guise of a professional photographer or just a gentleman looking for some modestly paid companionship, he would lure these women into a carefully laid trap. At his secluded cabin in the wilderness, he set the scene for the final stage of his macabre game. After the unspeakable horrors generally inflicted on his victims in the basement den of his house, he forced his victims into the final stages of their ordeal. Stripped of what little dignity they had remaining, all of his victims were handcuffed and told to run. And this was kind of a double bluff. It gave them the illusion of freedom, the fact that they were getting away, but it was just in fact the start of his hunt. And so he generally led them out of his cabin into the bleak Alaskan night. And the women, their senses dulled by terror, were then forced to sprint into the woods. Their bare feet pounded against the icy ground as they went forward, blinded and stumbling over trees and logs and twigs. But escape was a cruel fantasy. Hansen, a seasoned hunter, was lying in wait for them, using all of the skills and expertise he'd developed over the years. Quite often he would jump out on his victim and inflict a stab wound. This would leave a trail of blood for him, like breadcrumbs that he could follow. As the chase wore on, the women's initial surge of adrenaline just drifted into numbing cold and exhaustion. And eventually, as their energy waned, that was when Hansen delivered the final blow. He would emerge from his hiding place and deliver one precise shot from his rifle. After each kill, Hansen appeared to perform some form of grotesque ritual. He would remove their bindings, usually handcuffs, and he would try to cover up some evidence of what he'd done. If he had previously removed their clothes, sometimes he made them run naked, he would reclothe them. And then, methodically, he would dig a shallow grave for each of the victims, and after they had been buried, he would precisely mark the location of the burial site with an X on his aviation map. This was a map that would later reveal 37 of such marks and would be a silent testimony to the atrocities that he had committed. Now, during his confession, Robert Hansen had agreed a plea bargain with both the police and the prosecutors. He would plead guilty to at least 4 of the murders, the evidence for which was insurmountable. But his conditions were that there be minimal publicity for his crimes because he didn't want his family affected, and that when he was incarcerated it would be outside of Alaska. This plea bargain was agreed to, and he pled guilty to 4 counts of murder. But afterwards he did agree to give police and investigators details of further murders. Robert Hansen's trial and subsequent conviction sent shockwaves through Anchorage and beyond. People found it hard to reconcile the man that they knew, the local businessman who was a pillar of the community. And they were still reeling from the revelation that the man that they knew and trusted was capable of such atrocities. And even after his conviction, where he was sentenced to 461 years in prison with no possibility of parole, his malevolence loomed large. As part of his plea bargain, investigators would later force him to lead them to as many burial sites as he could remember as part of that agreement. And this he did, although many of the burial sites had either been ravaged by animals or had just disappeared through time. In 2014, at the age of 75, and having been moved back to Spring Creek Correctional Facility in Alaska, Robert Hansen died of natural causes. He probably took with him to his grave secrets, many of which will now never be unearthed. And yet the legacy of his terror still remains, a reminder that evil sometimes lurks in the most unassuming faces. And it shows us that in the frozen wilds of Alaska, even the command to run can be a sentence with no escape. Our condolences go out to the families of all the victims and all the families of those missing and not yet found. And on that note, and I'll ask you to stay curious and stay safe, and I'll thank you for watching.